Some years ago, I was visiting Athens, and after a busy morning walking the Monastiraki market, I found a small cafe for a bite and a cup of tea. Sitting down at a table for 6 was the only vacant table. I was soon asked by a small group of tourists if the other seats were taken. They sat, ordered, and we started chatting, and I asked the inevitable question, "Where are you all from?" "Israel," replied the older man. "Jerusalem." We exchanged snippets of our respective itineraries, and he asked me what I had planned for the rest of the day. I told him and asked him the same question. He replied that he had visited a Jewish museum and the remains of an old synagogue, and that this afternoon he was going to see the Acropolis. Well, you might wonder what that's got to do with today's reading. Not a lot, really, except as I read today's Gospel in preparation for writing this sermon, I find in the first paragraph that some Greeks are wanting to see Jesus. Great, I thought. I've got a Greek heritage. My father was a Greek refugee to this country. Surely a useful theme to at least start my sermon. Well, as things turned out, that was not to be. There is, of course, no further mention of the Greeks in our reading, and certainly no suggestion that they ever met Jesus. And what's more, many of the commentaries I consulted suggested that they may very well not have been Greek, more likely just Greek-speaking Gentiles. Greek or not, their presence does provide a helpful frame to the text, as at the ending of the reading we're told that even as Jesus is lifted up on the cross, Jesus will draw all people to himself. Perhaps this is John's hint that Jesus' mission includes not only the Jewish people and nation, but all people. His is a universalist message. However, as always, when we read John, we need to make sure that we don't read supersessionism into the passage. We must remember that the realm of God includes Gentiles, doesn't entail a rejection of the Jewish people. Jesus' quarrel isn't with his own people. It's with the religious political elite that have bought into the system and are now its tools. Let's go back to the beginning of our reading. "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Now, as Barnabas Linders has commented, he suggests that the word here in this context is fine, especially as the church and the Gentiles had to, for the most part, believe without even seeing Jesus. I must admit, however, that see is a word that I've never really thought that much about, other than to recognise that there's more to the notion of seeing than meets the eye. But how much more? It's an interesting word with, of course, a variety of meanings. The saying, seeing is believing? Well, what with the recent advances in AI allowing the manipulation of images, I'm not sure how that stacks up anymore. In answer to a child's request for a treat, well, we'll see about that. And all too often, after hearing a complicated explanation from someone, comes a, yes, I see, when in fact you have no idea what the person is getting at all. Yes, there are numerous ways in which we can understand the word, but in a situation such as this, we could approach it from two directions or 2 points of view. I like to term it the vertical, that allows for layers or depths of meaning to be explored, or the horizontal, which allows for an expansive exploration on the same level of understanding. Now I can hear you politely thinking, I see. Let me give you an example. When you see a gang patch, what do you see? What do you think? Do you see a violent, drug-dealing criminal who should be locked away and then the keys thrown away? Or do you see someone who has, in all probability, experienced poverty, violence, and trauma? Given the high proportion of prisoners who've experienced trauma of one kind or another, and often multiple traumas starting from early childhood, and given that many gang members have been imprisoned, it's no wonder that many gang members have sought a community to belong to that doesn't exclude them, but intuitively understands where they're coming from. I'm not suggesting that the average gang member is a lamb dressed in wolf's clothing. What I am suggesting is that there are sound sociological reasons for seeking membership in a gang. We could, I suggest, see the patch as a sign of a failing society, a badge of dishonour. Not for the gang member, but for us, for society. Ban it for all you're worth, but don't expect to see things change. I guess others might see in a patch all those votes that might have gone begging. The ability to see what is not accessible to ordinary sight is a theme in John. Also, it's not necessary to see in the literal sense in order to believe. The Gospel concludes with Jesus' words to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." The purpose of the Gospel is to record Jesus' signs for those who have not seen yet come to believe. Perhaps the seeking Greeks represent those of us for whom this Gospel is written. They do not receive a personal audience with Jesus, but the truth is revealed to them, along with us, in Jesus' speech foretelling the meaning of his death. Jesus' response to the request of the Greeks announces that the hour has come. In many respects, what follows is an interpretation of the hour for the world to hear. One way to view Jesus' last public discourse is an interpretation of that final sign of the gospel, Jesus' crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. Both this discourse and the farewell discourse later on are based on the fact that the hour is here. These two discourses share that perspective and shape what Jesus will say and how he will say it in the rest of John's Gospel. The first words of Jesus in our reading today, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you," and so on. There's a long tradition in the church of seeing how our service to God and one another is an act of love that allows us to express hate for the evil patterns of this world. If we need to see what loving and hating might look like as servants of God, then it would be hard to go past the following example. Oscar Romero, an El Salvadorian Catholic priest who worked for social justice and peace from violence, in a homily based on today's text and on the anniversary of a death of another activist, preached, and I'll quote some of it. He said, "Many do not understand, and they think Christianity should not get involved in such things. But to the contrary, you have just heard Christ's gospel, that one must not love oneself so much as to avoid getting involved in the risks of life which history demands of us. That who would avoid danger will lose their life, while those who out of love for Christ give themselves to the service of others will live. Like the grain of wheat that dies, but only apparently. If it did not die, it would remain alone. The harvest comes about because it dies, allows itself to be sacrificed in the earth and destroyed. Only by destroying itself does it produce the harvest. As he finished his sermon and transitioned to leading the celebration of the Mass, Ramiro spoke of its symbolism in the wheat and chalice. It was then that a hitman, likely hired by a right-wing political party leader, came into the church and shot Ramiro to death at the altar. That recounting seems most appropriate during this season of Lent, as I can draw some parallels to the death of Ramiro and the death of Jesus. Jesus knew that he was going to be executed at the hands of the powerful. Oscar more than likely knew that he was going to be executed again at the hands of the powerful. He just didn't know when. Both had a history of calling out the powerful and the wealthy. Both were powerful advocates for the poor and oppressed. In this instance, I know that you can only take the parallel so far, but in remembering Oscar Ramiro, we do have the opportunity to undertake a review of where our journey as Christians stand in the light of Easter understandings. Bit of a reminder here, a dictionary definition for the word review: a formal assessment of something with the intention of instituting change, if necessary. I'm not suggesting that we plan on martyrdom, but Easter does provide the opportunity to identify changes in how we might better hear the gospel message. For change is certainly a powerful Easter component. Everything changed with the crucifixion of Jesus. Without the crucifixion, there will be no resurrection and no ascension. Perhaps if we attempt to see ourselves in relation to the human Jesus through a horizontal lens, we may be able to identify and institute that Easter change that we hear every year. The parallel definitely breaks down when on the ascension Jesus becomes divine, something that humans can't become. Not that that's ever prevented some from claiming that they were. Back to that old saying, seeing is believing. In a few days' time, we'll enter into the heart of Easter via our liturgy, worship, and our remembering of Easter stories. We will see palm fronds being waved. We will see our altars stripped. We'll hear voices recounting the Easter story, and we will see a cross being carried. And in seeing these things, believing can become possible. Amen.